Number 110, 50 Shades of Grey. I could say a lot of bad things about this movie. I could poke fun at the story's origin as Twilight fanfiction. I could pick apart the terrible writing and nonsensical plot. I could rant about the jumpy editing ruining the perfectly adequate cinematography. I could even get all riled up about the stiff, uncomfortable acting and the nauseatingly awkward sex scenes that causes. But all of those things pale in comparison to my biggest problem with this movie. And my biggest problem with this movie is the portrayal of a manipulative, controlling, emotionally abusive stalker obsessing over a vulnerable young woman and using his wealth to pressure her into a relationship she doesn't want and is not comfortable with. This is a perfect setup for a thriller or even a horror film, but all of this is depicted as being romantic. Inappropriate and downright illegal behavior is made to look like a grand gesture of love, but that's a little hard to believe when the man doing all of this repeatedly states that he doesn't believe in romance and love. This sends the terrible message, particularly to women, that any of this behavior is even acceptable, let alone romantic. I'd like to end with a message to young people everywhere. If anyone treats you the way Christian Grey treats Anastasia Steele, please get help and stay as far away from them as possible, and don't watch this movie. Number 109, Pixels. If you've been living under a rock for the last few years and you've been spared the horror of Adam Sandler's recent films, then you must know a deeply satisfying piece that most of us can only dream of. Pixels certainly isn't the worst of these movies, but that's not saying much at all. There are some interesting ideas poking through the cracks in this shameless nostalgic cash grab. Video game characters attacking the real world sounds awesome. If nothing else, it should provide us with some cool action scenes, but sloppy writing and lazy direction renders that point moot. This movie does one thing quite well, and that's making talented actors look really bad. Whatever they paid Michelle Monaghan, it wasn't enough, and Peter Dinklage deserves a formal apology. When it comes right down to it, this movie's biggest problem is that it makes no sense. Plot points are randomly introduced and dropped as soon as they're no longer useful. Now, films are allowed to make up the rules of their own universe, but when they refuse to follow them, the audience loses interest. How can we be invested in a do-or-die situation when a third option could show up at any moment? Do yourself a favor and stay far away from this movie. Number 108, Entourage. Let me start this off by saying, I have only seen one episode of the show, and that was all I needed to see. I didn't get the appeal, and honestly I was ambivalent about this movie. Until I came across a GoFundMe page started by Bob's Burgers writer Wendy Molyneux Drake, wherein she described her contempt for all things Entourage, but promised to see the movie if $10,000 were raised for pediatric cancer research charity CureSearch. This goal was met easily, and due to stretch goals, over $30,000 were raised, and Wendy had to see the movie in theaters 4 times, after which she wrote a scathing review. So I had to know if this movie was really that bad. And boy, did it live up, or rather down, to those expectations. Led by 5 of the most vapid, self-centered characters ever put to film, a world of minor inconveniences with no lasting consequences unfolds in front of the backdrop of Hollywood glamour. Actual jokes are replaced with cameos galore. It's funny because they're famous? And no effort is made to have these characters learn anything or grow as people. It's crass, it's tasteless, but above all, it's boring. Do not watch. Number 107, Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse. I really don't have much to say about this movie. It doesn't bring anything new to the zombie genre, which at this point probably needs to die anyway. Pun completely intended. And as a comedy, it can't offer up any jokes that a person over the age of 13 would laugh at, which, given its R rating, makes it really unclear who this movie is for. There's nothing surprising about this script or the characters. The only really surprising aspect of this film is the casting of Ty Sheridan. This movie is a black spot on an otherwise stellar filmography, including films like Mud and Joe. He's a really talented young actor who deserves a lot better. Ultimately, this film can be summed up in one word: juvenile. Unless you're a hardcore zombie fan, and even then you should think twice, avoid this one like a rapidly spreading virus. Number 106, Paul Blart, Mall Cop 2. The first Mall Cop was a surprise hit, so I guess a sequel was inevitable. If nothing else, this movie is a shining example of what can happen when something is created out of obligation instead of inspiration. It's the exact same plot as the first film, with nothing but a change of setting to a Las Vegas hotel. So, does that technically make him Paul Blart Hotel Cop? Or Resort Cop? Oh, who cares? This movie does nothing to build on its predecessor except to undermine one of the more touching plot points of the first outing. Am I really questioning whether or not this movie has tainted the Paul Blart canon? Seriously, who cares? The only flash of life in this movie is during a brief exchange of threats between Kevin James and Neil McDonough, when the latter abandons all pretense and chews the scenery to bits, before returning to his role as standard boring villain number 17. The humor is childish, but I think even children would be bored by this, so if you don't see this movie, don't worry, you're not missing anything. Number 105, The Boy Next Door. What made me want to see this movie was the trailer. It looked like it was going to be full of painful innuendos and gratuitous close-ups of biceps, so I thought it might be good for a laugh, and in that regard, it does not disappoint. What I was not expecting was the insane Grindhouse-style climax. Think Cape Fear, except not good. This was listed as a thriller, but it's really hard to be thrilled by a story when it's obvious what's going to happen within the first 5 minutes. No, really, it's that predictable. This movie at least had a chance to be shocking in its depiction of an inappropriate relationship between a teacher and a high school student, but it cops out of that by making the student 20 years old, and having him played by a 27-year-old actor. I didn't expect this to be good, and it wasn't, so I can't really claim to be disappointed. But it's not bad enough to demand viewing, and it's not good by any stretch of the imagination. If you really love Jennifer Lopez, or biceps, check it out. If not, go ahead and skip this one. Number 104, Hot Pursuit. I know it's sort of a tradition for Oscar nominees to follow up their nominations with really terrible movies, and believe me, it has happened a lot this year. But none have failed quite so spectacularly as Reese Witherspoon in this film. Now, don't get me wrong, she's not to blame for this disaster, but after the grim realism she brought to the screen in Wild, her affected Texan accent and hapless naivete in this movie is jarring. With Sofia Vergara in tow, essentially playing a meaner version of her character from Modern Family, the two blunder their way through recycled hijinks and predictable twists. The blooper reel that rolls during the credits seems to show a group of people having fun making this movie. Unfortunately, none of that translates to the audience, and it actually kind of feels like salt in an open wound. Perhaps the most glaring problem, though, is the mishandling of the odd couple dynamic between the leads. The film tries to squeeze laughs from both characters' antics instead of letting one's reactions to the other's silliness create a realistic center for the viewers to identify with. See Planes, Trains, and Automobiles for a good example of this. I doubt I'll remember that I saw this in a year's time, so you probably shouldn't feel too bad about missing this one. Number 103, Serena. How can something that feels so right go so wrong? Based on a critically acclaimed and best-selling novel, and starring one of the most beloved screen pairings of the 2010s, this should be a home run. But a troubled production made this one of the biggest cautionary tales in filmmaking in recent memory. I won't pretend to know what happened behind the scenes to create this disaster, but what becomes clear to the viewer is that everyone involved in the making of this film was not on the same page. Moments of heightened emotion are briskly and awkwardly shuffled off screen before the audience has had time to process their impact, while the most mundane of occurrences are lingered upon to uncomfortable lengths. As a result, we never get to know the characters and have a hard time relating to their plight. I wanted so badly for this to succeed because so many intriguing plot threads exist in this movie. Corruption, betrayal, trust, redemption. But sadly, most of these are dropped completely and only picked up clumsily later on. I suppose if there's any lesson to be learned here, it's that movies are like children, and it really does take a village. So unless you really enjoy being baffled for 2 hours, maybe steer clear of this. Number 102, Fantastic Four. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'd like to point out that this movie was made out of necessity, and not passion for the material. And while the Fantastic Four films directed by Tim Story are objectively bad, they're still fresh in our memory. Now, whereas the similarly rebooted to keep the right Spider-Man movies directed by Mark Webb differentiated themselves from Sam Raimi's trilogy by attempting to carbon copy the source material and doubling down on the CGI, Josh Trank's Fantastic Four simply tries to make its mark by removing any trace of fun or joy from the story. Now, while I do think it's interesting to imagine how terrifying it could be to find out you can make yourself invisible or set yourself aflame at will, If all that comes after is somber resignation, then I'm not sure I want to spend 2 hours pondering how awful it would be to have superpowers. At the very least, I hoped for some cheap thrills in the form of cheesy one-liners and wanton destruction sequences that superhero movies usually deliver. Sadly, only ham-fisted expository dialogue and sparse action finds its way onto the screen. All that can be done at this point is to be thankful that this will likely not get a sequel and only be remembered as a curious misstep in the early years of some great actors. But if you want to know how not to make a superhero movie, go ahead and give this a watch. Number 101, Jem and the Holograms. When the first trailer for this movie was released, and for several months thereafter, I had no idea that Jem and the Holograms was a kids' show in the 80s, and you probably wouldn't be able to tell that it was by watching this movie either. It's blatantly obvious that this film is catered to the YouTube generation, but curiously, it shies away from nostalgia by eschewing any connection to its glam rock roots, which, given the nostalgia-crazed climate of pop culture these days, leads me to believe that the filmmakers were tragically misguided in the production of this film. But putting aside its failings as an adaptation, it's simply not a good movie. There seem to be two completely separate plots unfolding simultaneously. A teenage rise-to-fame fantasy and a mystery scavenger hunt a la National Treasure. These two never really seem to intertwine, and neither really pays off in a truly satisfying way. There's also a lot of overly contrived conflict in this script that unnecessarily pads the runtime. Add in the shameful waste of some very talented supporting actors, and you should have plenty of reasons to skip this one. But given that this movie was pulled from theaters after only 2 weeks, it seems that message is plain enough.